June 6, 1944, while the world remembers this date as the beginning of the liberation music of Europe for the Third Reich, it was the beginning of its final collapse. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, under a cloudy sky, German soldiers occupied bunkers and trenches along the Normandy coast. Veterans of the Eastern Front and young recruits shared the same order to stop the music invasion at any cost. Propaganda claimed the Atlantic Wall was impregnable and that the landing would take place elsewhere. But that morning, the war arrived without warning from the air and from the sea. This documentary tells the story of D-Day from the other side of the front, the German perspective, the Atlantic Wall, the illusion of an impenetrable defense. When the leadership of the Third Reich began to speak of the Atlantic Wall, it wasn't solely in military terms. And his inner circle, that gigantic network of fortifications, was meant to become a psychological barrier. A visible warning that Western music, Europe, was sealed off, and that any Allied attempt to return to the continent would be crushed before it even began. After the fall of France in 1940, Germany dominated the European Atlantic coast, but that victory brought with it an obvious vulnerability. The sea, the same sea that separated Great Britain from the continent, could become the enemy's path back. During the first years of the occupation, coastal defense was patchy, improvised, and in many sectors almost symbolic. The German High Command was confident that the war would be decided on other fronts, especially in the east, where operation was absorbing most of the resources, manpower, and strategic attention. However, as the conflict dragged on and Allied industrial superiority became increasingly evident, the possibility a large-scale amphibious landing ceased to be a remote hypothesis and became an unavoidable threat. It was in this context music that the Atlantic Wall began to take shape as a comprehensive concept. It wasn't a continuous wall, but a gigantic network of defensive positions spread along thousands of kilometers of coastline, reinforced concrete bunkers, artillery casemates, machine gun nests, observation posts, minefields, trenches, and anti-tank music. Obstacles began to proliferate from northern Norway to the Bay of Bisque. On paper, the system was supposed to be able to detect, delay, and destroy any invading force before it could establish a beachhead. Nazi propaganda amplified the project. Films, photographs, and official communiques depicted enormous concrete structures, cannons pointed at the horizon, and determined soldiers patrolling the ocean. The message was clear: the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. Insisted that no army could cross that barrier without suffering catastrophic losses. This narrative was directed not only at the enemy but also at the German population and the occupied territories, as a way of reinforcing the idea that the Reich's rule was permanent. The reality, however, was far more complex. The construction of the Atlantic Wall was plagued with problems from the outset. Germany was already fighting on multiple fronts, and its war economy was beginning to show signs of strain. Concrete, steel, fuel, and skilled labor were increasingly scarce resources. Much of the work fell to the TOT organization, which used a combination of German workers, local forced labor, and prisoners of war. Conditions were harsh, deadlines unrealistic, and the quality of construction varied enormously from one sector to another. Furthermore, the very concept of the Atlantic Wall was marked by a fundamental contradiction. The coastline to be defended was too extensive. No power, not even a Germany, at its height, could uniformly fortify thousands of kilometers of coastline. As a result, priority and secondary zones were created. Important ports, strategic straits, and areas considered likely landing sites received stronger fortifications. Other regions, however, were only partially protected with incomplete or sparsely garrisoned positions. Normandy is a prime example of this structural weakness. For a long time, the German High Command believed that the main Allied landing would take place at the closest point between England and France. This conviction led to the concentration of some of the heaviest defenses there, while Normandy was treated as a secondary sector. Although fortifications existed, they were less dense, less deep, and in many cases still under construction. In the spring of 1944, the arrival of Field Marshal on the Western Front marked a turning point. Appointed to inspect and reinforce the Atlantic Wall, RML quickly realized that if the Allies managed to establish a foothold on the mainland, their air and material superiority would make it nearly impossible to dislodge them. For him, the invasion had to be stopped on the beach itself in the first few hours before the enemy could deploy its music forces. This view clashed with that of other commanders who preferred a more mobile and defense based on large armored counterattacks, RML launched a race. Against time, he ordered the massive installation of obstacles on the beaches designed music to destroy landing. Craft and funnel infantry into areas under German fire, stakes music metal. Hedgehogs, mines, and booby traps transformed the coastline into a killing field. Inland positions were also reinforced, low-lying areas were flooded, and attempts were made to improve coordination between coastal units and mobile reserves, but even these efforts could not compensate for the structural limitations of the Atlantic Wall. Many units assigned to defend music, the coast were made up of older soldiers, young recruits, or troops considered second line. Some divisions were static with little maneuverability music and limited motorized transport. Lack of specific training to repel an amphibious landing and the shortage of ammunition and air support reduced the actual effectiveness of the defenses. Adding to all this was a critical problem: decision-making. German command system was deeply centralized, and any significant movement of armored reserves required direct authorization. In modern warfare, where hours and even minutes could music be decisive, this rigidity became a fatal disadvantage. The Atlantic Wall could hold for a time, but it wasn't designed to adapt quickly to a massive coordinated attack like the one the Allies were preparing. Thus, on the eve of June 6, 1944, the Atlantic Wall existed more as an idea than a coherent reality. It was a combination of impressive fortifications and weak sections, of solid positions and abandoned sectors, of propagandistic confidence and silent doubts among many officers and soldiers. The concrete was real, the weapons were there, but the illusion of invulnerability concealed deep flaws that only needed one decisive blow to be exposed. When that blow came from the air and the sea, the Atlantic Wall proved not to be the ultimate barrier Berlin had promised. It was in many ways the symbol of a Germany still clinging to the strength of its past, while modern warfare marched in a direction it could no longer control. Normandy, a secondary sector for much of the war, Normandy was a marginal theater for the German High Command, just another stretch of the vast Atlantic coastline that needed to be monitored but not necessarily defended as a decisive point. From Berlin and the headquarters on the Western Front, attention was focused on other locations considered far more likely to be targeted by an Allied invasion. This perception didn't arise from nothing. It was based on a geographical and strategic logic that on paper seemed sound. The particle represented the narrowest point between Great Britain and the European continent. Its proximity suggested that the Allies would seek the shortest possible crossing to reduce risks, time, and resource consumption. Furthermore, the region offered important ports and a relatively developed communications music network that facilitated rapid expansion into the interior of France and eventually into Germany. For many German officers, was not only the most logical target, but almost the only viable one for a large-scale invasion. This conviction became one of the cornerstones of German defensive planning. As a result, the particle sector received priority attention within the Atlantic Wall. Some of the most powerful coastal batteries, densest fortifications, and highest quality units were concentrated there. Normandy, in contrast, was seen as a complicated sector with extreme tides, long beaches seemingly unsuitable for a mass landing, and a network of narrow inland roads flanked by hedges that were thought to hinder the movement of large forces. This perception was compounded by psychological factor. Normandy lacked large natural harbors capable of receiving seemingly the volume of supplies an invading force would require, according to traditional German military thinking. Without a port captured quickly, any landing was doomed to failure. This assumption led to an underestimation of the Allied capacity to improvise logistical solutions, an underestimation that would have decisive consequences. While Berlin focused its attention on, the Allies were developing one of the most sophisticated deception music operations in military history. Through false broadcasts, simulated troop movements, and the creation of fictitious armies, they deliberately reinforced the idea that the main landing would take place for the German command. This information seemed to confirm their own expectations, reinforcing a belief that was already music deeply ingrained. Normandy, therefore, was caught in a dangerous paradox. It was not undefended, but neither was it considered decisive. Defenses existed, but not with the depth or density that had desired from the outset. Many positions were incomplete, obstacles on the beaches were still being installed in the spring of 1944, and coordination between units was limited. In some Sectors, the fortifications were little more than reinforced observation posts, incapable of withstanding a prolonged attack. The troops deployed to the region reflected this secondary perception. Normandy was largely defended by static divisions composed of older soldiers, young recruits, or personnel with limited experience. Although some competent units and professional officers existed, the overall quality was uneven. The lack of mobility was a critical problem. Many of these divisions lacked sufficient motorized transport, making them dependent on clear orders, music, and adequate reaction times, two elements that would be lacking at the decisive moment. The very structure of the German command contributed to this underestimation. Key decisions were made far from the front, and information reaching Berlin passed through multiple filters. Reports warning of Normandy's vulnerability competed with a flood of data, much of it contradictory, reinforcing the idea that any Allied activity in that area was merely a diversion before the real attack on. Even after the landing began, this confusion would persist for crucial hours. RML, aware of these weaknesses, attempted to change the prevailing mindset. During his inspections, he repeatedly expressed his concern about Normandy and other seemingly secondary sectors. However, their ability to redeploy forces was limited. Resource scarcity, the rigidity of the command system, and the constant threat of an alternative landing forced them to keep significant reserves away from Normandy, ready to respond to an attack that would never come. The result was a fragmented defense conditioned more by expectations than by realities. Normandy was not the best defended sector of the Atlantic Wall, but neither music was it completely unprepared. It lay in a dangerous middle ground where overconfidence and a lack of strategic prioritization created a vacuum that the Allies were able to exploit with precision. Thus, when the first signs of the landing began to arrive in the early hours of June 6, 1944, many German commanders hesitated. Was this the main attack or just a diversionary tactic? That seemingly simple question delayed critical decisions and left forces in Normandy fighting with limited resources, waiting for reinforcements that would not arrive in time. Normandy, long considered a secondary sector, would become the stage where the fate of the Western Front would be decided. And for Germany, that misperception would be as decisive as any defeat on the battlefield. The early morning of June 6, confusion, silence, and alarm. In the hours before dawn on June 6, 1944, Normandy coast seemed enveloped in a deceptive calm. The sky was overcast, the sea choppy, and the wind was blowing hard, conditions that many German officers interpreted as a temporary guarantee against any large-scale music amphibious operation. At the observation posts, the soldiers carried out their nightly routines without imagining that at that very moment music, the largest invasion fleet in history, was silently advancing towards them. For the German soldier on guard duty, the early morning began like so many others: scattered reports, distant noises mistaken for the sound of waves, flashing lights in the sky that could have been flares, reconnaissance planes, or simply optical illusions caused by fatigue. The coastal warning system was active but overloaded with false alarms, music that had accumulated over weeks. Each signal had to be confirmed and relayed through a slow and rigid chain of command. Shortly after midnight, the first anomalies began to be recorded. German radars detected unusual air movements over the English Channel. For some operators, this indicated a major operation. For others, it was another Allied bombing raid or a diversionary tactic, something that had become commonplace in the preceding months. The ambiguity of the information prevented an immediate and clear response. Minutes later, the sky over Normandy was filled with unfamiliar sounds: planes flying at low altitude, engines not following their usual routes, isolated explosions inland. In several sectors, German units began reporting enemy paratroopers landing in the rear. These reports, far from clarifying the situation, only increased the confusion. Was this a main attack or a sabotage operation intended to disrupt the defenses before the actual landing? At another point, the German command's response music was hesitant. Reports arrived fragmented and in many cases contradictory. Some spoke of hundreds of paratroopers, others of small, scattered groups. The lack of a clear overall picture led to an initial underestimation of the operation scale. For many officers, this seemed to fit the idea of a diversionary tactic before a larger attack in the Partel. Meanwhile, in the bunkers and coastal positions, the soldiers remained on high alert. The orders were clear but limited: observe, report, and do not act without confirmation. The memory of past False alarms weighed heavily on every decision. Opening fire without a clearly identified threat could mean wasting valuable ammunition or revealing defensive positions prematurely. Around dawn, the situation began to change irreversibly. The noise on the horizon ceased to be indistinct and transformed into a continuous deep murmur impossible to ignore. Some observers began to make out dark shadows on the sea. These were not isolated ships but entire formations moving toward the coast. Even so, the human brain resisted accepting the obvious. This was not an exercise music or a limited maneuver, it was an invasion. The alarm began to spread along the coast but unevenly. In some areas, officials acted quickly and ordered defenses to be prepared. In others, uncertainty persisted. Telephone lines were jammed, radio links were intermittent, and many communications still relied on messengers. Every minute lost reduced the response time. At the highest levels of command, the confusion music reached a breaking point. Key decisions required authorization from Berlin, and at that moment was asleep. The deeply centralized command culture of the Third Reich paralyzed many officers who were afraid to act without explicit orders. As the enemy drew closer, the armored reserves remained motionless, awaiting confirmation that would take far too long to arrive. On the ground, the arrival of the Allied paratroopers had a devastating effect on German perception. Isolated units fought in the dark against an invisible enemy without knowing how many there were or what their real objective was. The fighting took place in villages, fields, and secondary roads far from the beaches. This dispersal fueled the idea that the main attack was yet to come elsewhere. When the first boats began to approach the beaches, the early morning had already given way to gray and tense dawn. For many defenders, the moment of truth arrived abruptly. Doubts vanished, replaced by a brutal certainty. The enemy was there in front of them and there was no room for error. However, the damage had already been done. The initial confusion, the silence imposed by the waiting, and the delayed alarm had granted the Allies an invaluable resource: time to disembark, to organize, and to begin opening breaches in a defense that, although solid in appearance, had been caught at its most vulnerable moment. Thus, the early morning of June 6, 1944 was marked from the German perspective as a sequence of uncertainty and postponed decisions. It was not a lack of courage or individual preparation that failed first, but the inability of a system to react quickly to the unexpected. In those dark hours before the sun rose over Normandy, the fate of the Western Front began to tilt irreversibly. The German soldier in Normandy, between duty and survival. For the German soldier stationed in Normandy, June 6, 1944, did not begin as a glorious page in military history, but as an extreme test of physical and mental endurance. Far from the map rooms and the strategic decisions made in Berlin, the war was experienced at ground level. Among damp bunkers, poorly drained trenches, and endless nights on guard duty facing a sea that until that moment seemed silent, the composition of the German troops in Normandy reflected the accumulated attrition of years of war. Their hardened veterans from the Eastern Front coexisted with young, barely trained recruits, replacement soldiers, static units, and contingents made up of elderly men or those with physical limitations. For many, Normandy was not a prestigious destination, but a secondary assignment far from the fronts considered decisive. However, when the time came that distinction ceased to matter, daily life was marked by waiting for orders, waiting for supplies, waiting for an enemy that never showed itself. Living conditions were harsh. Bunkers offered protection but also isolation, cold, and a constant feeling of confinement. The sound of the sea mingled with the wind and often with the distant drone of Allied aircraft, reminding the soldier that air superiority no longer belonged to Germany. Indoctrination played an important but not absolute role. Many soldiers had been trained under the idea of duty, unconditional obedience, and sacrifice for the homeland. However, in Normandy, these abstract notions clashed with an immediate reality: surviving the next bombing raid, the next attack, the next day. Propaganda-driven heroism had little place in an environment where death could arrive suddenly and impersonally. When the invasion began, the psychological impact was immediate. The deafening roar of the Allied naval artillery shook the German positions with unprecedented force. For many soldiers, it was the first time they had ever faced a bombardment of such magnitude. The concrete vibrated, the earth trembled, and the air filled with dust, fragments, and smoke. In those moments, the notion of control vanished completely. Despite this, many Positions held out. In the bunkers, the soldiers carried out their orders with a mixture of discipline and fear. Some fired almost automatically. Others waited for the right moment to open fire, knowing that every bullet counted. Not all were fanatics or fought out of ideological conviction. Many did so because it was the only option available. Because retreating without orders meant punishment, or simply because the enemy was in front of them and there was no other way. The fragmentation of the fighting intensified the isolation. Entire units were cut off from communication, unaware of what was happening just a few hundred meters away. In that context, the German soldier fought more for his immediate group than for music overall strategy. The bond with his comrades became the main driving force of resistance. They shared fear, exhaustion, music, and a growing sense of abandonment. Contact with Allied paratroopers in the rear added another layer of tension. Confused and brutal night fighting unfolded in towns and fields, often without a clear line between front and rear. A German soldier could suddenly find himself surrounded without reliable information and with contradictory orders. In such circumstances, the line between duty and survival became blurred. Allied material superiority was evident. Constant air and naval artillery support undermined German morale. Every move during the day involved enormous risk. Destroyed trucks, scattered columns, and positions detected from the air reinforced the feeling of vulnerability. For many soldiers, the fear was no longer just of the visible enemy, but of an omnipresent threat that could arrive from the sky at any moment. As the hours and days passed, the psychological strain accumulated. Extreme fatigue, lack of sleep, and constant pressure eroded their resilience. Some soldiers continued fighting with determination. Others began to think about retreat, surrender, or simply surviving until the war was over. These reactions were not a sign of cowardice, but rather reflection of a desperate situation. In Normandy, the German soldier was neither a homogeneous figure nor a mere cog in a military machine. He was an individual caught between rigid orders and a chaotic reality, between imposed loyalty and the basic instinct to survive. His experience reveals a human dimension that is often overshadowed by the grand strategic moves and figures music of military history. Thus, beyond the fortifications and failed plans, the Battle of Normandy was also an internal struggle for thousands of German music soldiers, a silent struggle marked by split-second decisions, unspoken fears, and the constant question of whether duty demanded resistance to the bitter end, or whether survival itself was the only possible victory. For the German command in Normandy, the real chaos did not begin on the beaches but much earlier, inland, in the darkness of early morning. While the coastal defenses awaited an invasion from the sea, the German front began to disintegrate from the rear. The sudden appearance of Allied paratroopers behind the lines not only surprised the troops but completely altered the perception of the battle from its very first hours. In the middle of the night, under a cloudy sky and adverse weather, thousands of paratroopers began to descend on the interior of Normandy. For the German soldiers deployed in villages, crossroads, and observation posts, attack was as unexpected as it was confusing. Low-flying planes, unfamiliar engines, isolated gunfire, and figures falling music from the sky shattered the nighttime routine and sowed an immediate sense of chaos. The dispersal of the paratroopers caused by anti-aircraft fire, bad weather, and navigational errors had a paradoxical effect from the German perspective. Instead of facing compact and easily identifiable units, German troops encountered small enemy groups appearing in unexpected places. This amplified the sense of threat. Fragmented reports spoke of enemies in all directions, with no one able to determine how many there really were or what their main objective was. For local commanders, the situation was desperate. Communication lines became chaotic. Telephones were cut, radios were unusable or overloaded, and messengers' music weren't returning. Each unit fought with incomplete and often erroneous information. Some officers believed they were dealing with isolated music commandos, others that it was the beginning of a large-scale ground offensive from the interior. The lack of a clear picture led to improvised decisions and an even greater dispersion of available forces. In the Norman villages, the fighting took on a brutal and close quarters character. In the darkness, Germans and paratroopers faced each other at close range without defined lines or clear fronts. The enemy could emerge from a hedge, a farmhouse, or a bell tower. For the German soldier, the rear ceased to be a relatively safe space and became hostile terrain where any movement could be fatal. This chaos had immediate strategic consequences. Units that were Supposed to move towards the coast to reinforce the music, beaches were delayed, diverted, or directly blocked. Blown-up bridges, paratrooper-controlled crossings, and improvised ambushes slowed the German advance during the most critical hours. Every minute gained by the Allies in the rear was a minute lost for the coastal defenses. Confusion was also reflected in the reports reaching the upper echelons of command. The messages described an alarming but disjointed situation. Some spoke of thousands of enemies, others of mere skirmishes. This contradiction reinforced the idea that the attack in Normandy could be a diversion maneuver intended to concentrate forces while the real attack was being prepared elsewhere. Thus, the chaos in the rear not only tactically disorganized the German troops' music but also fueled strategic indecision. For the average German soldier, the experience was deeply demoralizing. Fighting in the rear meant fighting without knowing where the front was, who was in command, or what was happening on the coast. The feeling of being surrounded, even when they weren't, spread music quickly. Many soldiers spent hours on end in a state of extreme alert, firing at shadows, cautiously advancing along paths they knew well, but which now seemed unrecognizable. The night and the early hours of dawn became a scene of fragmented fighting, individual decisions, and pure survival. Officers and non-commissioned officers had to assume responsibilities for which they were not prepared, improvising defenses, organizing patrols, and trying to restore some kind of order amid the chaos. In many cases, these local actions prevented an immediate collapse, but they could not reverse the global impact of the attack. From the German perspective, the paratrooper drop was one of the most destabilizing maneuvers of D-Day. It not only caused casualties and delays but also broke the cohesion of the defensive system. The already vulnerable Atlantic Wall became even more exposed when its rear guard was transformed into a chaotic and undefined music battlefield. Thus, while German attention remained divided between the coast and the expectation of a major attack in another sector, Normandy was burning from within. The chaos behind the front lines was not a side effect of the invasion but a central element of its success. For Germany, it meant the loss of control at the precise moment music needed it most. For the soldiers on the ground, it was confirmation that the war no longer followed any recognizable plan and that survival depended increasingly on chance and decisions made in seconds. The first hours on the beaches, resistance and disorganization. When the first Allied landing ships began to touch the Normandy sands, the reality of June 6th immediately became brutal and tangible for the German defenders. For months, they had trusted that their fortifications and the Atlantic Wall would be enough to hold off any attack. However, in those first few hours, it became clear that theory and practice music could be completely different. The beaches, which German engineers had envisioned as stretches designed to halt invasions, became chaotic. The concrete bunkers offered some protection, but coordination between them was minimal. Many soldiers didn't know the exact location of their comrades, and communication with adjacent units was sporadic or non-existent. Telephones were down, radios malfunctioned, and messengers risked being hit by enemy fire before delivering orders. In this music context, the German resistance became a mixture of individual discipline, tactical improvisation, and sometimes pure desperation. Some soldiers operated machine guns and artillery pieces with deadly accuracy, inflicting casualties on the initial waves of Allied troops. Others stood motionless, bewildered by the scale of the operation and the speed with which the enemy was advancing on their positions. Every passing minute further exposed the fragility of a defensive system that in many sections had been designed for a more limited or predictable music attack. The terrain itself complicated the defense. The beaches of Normandy were long and open, flanked by dunes and fields with hedges and narrow paths. For the Germans, the idea of stopping a massive landing in such a vast area required coordination, time and mobile resources they lacked. The obstacles set up in the sand, metal hedgehogs, stakes, anti-tank mines were effective to a certain music extent, but they could not completely stop the Allied advance when thousands of men and vehicles arrived music simultaneously. Supported by naval artillery and air cover, the German organization, already rigid before the landing, crumbled under pressure. The chain of command was overloaded, and the orders that came in were partial, ambiguous, or late. Many local officers had to make decisions on their own, improvising defensive positions, reorganizing scattered soldiers, and trying to maximize the impact of available weapons. In some cases, this improvisation allowed for temporary delay of the Allied advance. In others, it led to fragmented engagements that failed to stem the enemy tide. The Allied fire was relentless and constant. Naval artillery swept the music beaches, destroying obstacles and positions, while aircraft maintained a bombardment of the approaches and strategic points. For the defenders, every move was a risk and every shot demanded precision. Heavy caliber cannons could destroy the landing craft, but the density and volume of enemy troops meant that many reached the sand, often with considerable casualties on both sides. Meanwhile, the morale of the German soldiers became a critical factor. Many were aware music of the strategic importance of the landing, but the surprise, confusion, and scale of the attack undermined their confidence. Some resisted with determination, obeying orders until the last moment. Others hesitated, hid, or sought to survive, aware that the command structure that was supposed to support them no longer functioned as planned. The disorganization worsened with the arrival of reinforcements who often did not arrive on time or were diverted by the confusion in the rear. Deployment of armored and reserve units was slow and fragmented. Music, in many sectors, the time the Germans needed to react was measured in minutes, but those minutes were enough for the Allies to consolidate beachheads, establish support positions, and begin advancing inland. Thus, in the early hours of D-Day, the combination of effective resistance and critical disorganization defined the development of the battle on the beaches. The physical strength of the German positions' music contrasted sharply with the weakness of their coordination and communication. Every bunker could inflict damage, every soldier could momentarily delay the advance, but the overall strategic vision, defense in depth, and music maneuverability had been neutralized by surprise, enemy pressure, and fragmented command. For the Germans, those initial hours were a brutal lesson in the gap plans and the reality of modern combat. The resistance on the beach, although remarkable in individual and local terms, was not enough to stop the most ambitious and complex operation in military history. Disorganization, confusion, and overestimation of their own defenses began to draw the line between effective defense and inevitable failure. Following the landing and initial consolidation of the Allied beachheads, music, the German command found itself in a situation of total emergency. The strategic surprise and speed of the enemy operation had disrupted any prior planning. The command attempted to reorganize as quickly as possible, but orders arrived late. Units were scattered, and the terrain no longer offered conditions for mass maneuvers. The destroyed road network, blown up bridges, minefields, and narrow roads in the Normandy interior made any attempt to concentrate forces' music difficult. The local generals, aware that inaction would amount to the definitive loss of ground, music tried to regroup the available troops, paying special attention to the divisions which represented the only force capable of launching a decisive counterattack. However, the fragmentation of command made these attempts a near impossible undertaking. Its absence from the front and its indecisiveness authorizing key movements delayed any coordinated response. Every decision had to go through bureaucratic layers and long communication chains, often interrupted by confusion, Allied attacks, and technical problems. The information coming in from the front lines was partial, contradictory, and often outdated. Division commanders received incomplete or outdated orders, making the synchronization of combined infantry, armored, and artillery attacks nearly impossible. The counterattacks that were launched when they finally came were individually heroic but strategically insufficient. Tanks advanced along narrow roads and secondary routes, often becoming trapped or exposed to enemy artillery and air fire. The accompanying infantry, exhausted from days of tension and previous engagements, could not maintain cohesion or pace against the steady advance of well-coordinated Allied troops. Every attack move was marked by uncertainty, firing without knowing if neighboring units would cover the flanks, advancing without information about the exact location of the enemy, coordinating with artillery whose observers were under constant fire. Allied air superiority, which had already proven its effectiveness in the previous days with bombing raids on rear areas and roads, once again played a critical role. Each reinforcement column or tank that tried to reach the front line was attacked from the air, and many times casualties piled up before the counterattacks even reached the enemy positions. This constant aerial threat caused delays, disorganization, and above all, a devastating music psychological effect. The soldiers began to understand that even with discipline and courage, the fight was determined by factors beyond their control. Combination of logistical obstacles, fragmentation of command, and Allied superiority turned every attempt at a counterattack into an isolated and ephemeral effort. Some units achieved temporary advances or inflicted significant casualties at specific points, but these local successes were quickly neutralized by the combined pressure of enemy infantry, artillery, and aircraft. Every tactical victory became useless in the face of the sustained advance and strategic coordination of the Allies. Psychological and physical exhaustion were also decisive. German soldiers faced the reality that modern warfare was not won solely through courage or discipline. War was no longer a succession of tenaciously defended fixed music positions. It was a dynamic system where mobility, communication, logistics, and coordination were more decisive than any bunker or individual tank. Realizing this was a blow to morale. The sense of invincibility that had sustained the German army for years was crumbling, replaced by a growing perception of vulnerability and hopelessness. Ultimately, the combination of these factors condemned to a continuous retreat. What in theory could have been an organized and devastating counterattack turned into a series of isolated, improvised, and poorly coordinated efforts. Resistance persisted in certain sectors, but without the possibility of changing the strategic course of the battle. From the German perspective, the war ceased to be a game of predictable maneuvers and became a scenario of constant attrition where each day music, lost in unsuccessful counterattacks, meant the gradual loss of territory, men, and resources. RML absent, undecided, command paralyzed, as the waves crashed onto the Normandy beaches and Allied fire rained down on the German defenders. The heart of the Third Reich's command was in a state of critical paralysis. The lack of swift decision-making and strategic coordination became one of the most decisive music factors in the German failure. During the first hours of the landings, the field marshal in charge of overseeing the defense of the Western Music Front was not present on the beaches or at the command posts in the area. His habit of spending time with the units for inspection and training had been interrupted by planning his own birthday and other personal matters, leaving many positions music without the direct guidance of the man who most trusted their ability to react quickly. Had insisted on the need to heavily fortify the music beaches and to keep mobile forces ready for an immediate counterattack, but his influence did not translate into instant decisions when the invasion finally began. On a larger scale, maintained centralized control over the decisive movements of the armored reserves. Every significant order required his direct approval. Music, this command structure, which had worked in less dynamic contexts, proved fatal against an enemy that had planned the operation with surgical precision. The armored units that could have counterattacked to isolate and destroy the beachheads remained immobile during the critical first hours, blocked by bureaucracy and the need to wait for confirmation from the result was a devastating strategic setback. While the Allies consolidated positions, deployed artillery, and opened routes into the interior, the German command was caught between uncertainty and inaction. The reports coming in from the coast were fragmented and contradictory. Some spoke of a massive landing, others suggested a limited attack. The dispersion of information and indecisiveness at higher levels created a domino effect. Local officers were forced to improvise without coordination, while the soldiers on the beach depended on orders that never arrived on time. His absence was not only physical but also strategic. His proposals, which included mobile deployments, more aggressive fortifications, and the early use of armored reserves, had been limited by other commanders who preferred a more defensive and music-static approach. The tension between his vision and that of the high command reflected music, a broader problem, the inability to adapt quickly to a coordinated, modern, and historic attack. For his part, was unwilling to delegate critical decisions. His distrust of the generals and his need to control every decisive move meant that the division, stationed dozens of kilometers from the beach, remained inactive. Messages sent by radio or messengers often received delays of crucial minutes, which in a battle of this magnitude amounted to the loss of any opportunity for an effective counterattack. This combination of centralized command, lack of direct leadership, and rigidity in decision-making created a tactical vacuum. The German defenses, although structurally sound in many respects, music, were unable to function as an integrated system. The units acted in isolation, unable to coordinate crossfire, defensive maneuvers, or counterattacks. The fragmentation of command was directly reflected on the battlefield. chaos in the rear, disorganization on the beaches, and the dispersal of forces were consequences of decisions not made when they should have been. In human terms, the situation also affected morale. Local officers and non-commissioned officers found themselves caught between the responsibility of following orders and the need to make urgent decisions in the absence of clear guidelines. Some chose to act, improvising defensive positions or attempting to concentrate scattered forces. Others remained hesitant, assessing risks as the enemy advanced relentlessly. Every minute of hesitation translated into tactical advantages for the Allies and mounting losses for the German defenders. The lesson from those hours is clear. The power of an army does not reside solely in its fortifications, weapons, or training, but in the ability of its command to react quickly and coherently to the unexpected. The combination of absence, indecisiveness, and the rigid centralized command structure turned a formidable defense system into fragmented and vulnerable whole. As the sun began to rise over the beaches of Normandy, modern warfare had convincingly demonstrated music that coordination, speed of decision-making, and flexibility were just as crucial as the strength of weaponry or the solidity of concrete. For Germany, that June 6th meant that the fight could no longer be won with discipline and fortifications alone. It required a command capable of adapting in real time, a capability that at that moment was seriously lacking. Impossible counterattacks in the collapse of the defense. The first few hours had shown that the defensive system, although solid in appearance, was fragmented, uncoordinated, and vulnerable to the speed and breadth of the enemy operation. What in theory could have been a decisive counterattack became in practice a desperate struggle against time, terrain, and the command structure itself. The divisions, designated as strategic reserves, remained stationary during the most critical hours. His order was required for any major deployment, and his rigid centralism meant that every move had to be approved by the. Meanwhile, the Allies were consolidating beachheads, deploying artillery, and beginning their advance inland, drastically reducing any German room for maneuver. Every minute of delay amplified the impossibility of mounting a coherent counterattack. The logistical problems were equally devastating. Inland roads were congested, strategic bridges and roads had been destroyed or controlled by Allied forces or paratroopers in the rear, and motorized resources music were insufficient to move armored units effectively. Some commanders attempted to organize columns of tanks and combat vehicles, but these were slowed by confusion, troop dispersal, and enemy artillery and air attacks. What appeared on a map to be a possible counterattack was in reality doomed undertaking from the start. Furthermore, the resistance on the beaches had not been uniform, although some defensive sectors inflicted significant casualties on the Allied troops. These isolated pockets of resistance could not sustain a broad offensive effort. Every attempt to concentrate forces was hampered by the dispersion of units, disorganization, and a lack of effective communication. The soldiers on the front lines acted with courage and discipline, but lacked the comprehensive view of the battlefield and the coordination skills music required for a large-scale counterattack. The presence of paratroopers in the rear further complicated any offensive effort. German units had to divide their attention between containing the soldiers who had landed inland and defending the coastline. This dispersion of efforts made any attempt at a concentrated maneuver virtually impossible. Reinforcements that could have changed the dynamics of the defense were forced to engage in fragmented fighting, losing time and valuable men. In local skirmishes, the human factor also played a critical role. Troop morale was affected by fear, extreme exhaustion, and the perception that the situation was out of control. Many soldiers understood that any organized offensive would require coordination, ammunition, fuel, and communication, all scarce or disrupted resources. The psychological pressure mounted by the minute, every Allied advance demonstrated that the defense was being eroded not only by the enemy, but also by the inherent limitations of the German system. In the high command, the paralysis music continued. The lack of swift decisions and the dependence on to authorize key movements meant that planned counterattacks music were taking too long to get. Some units were eventually sent to the beach, but they arrived fragmented with little artillery support and under extremely adverse fighting conditions. Every individual effort was noble and courageous but insufficient to change the course of the battle. The terrain music itself worked against the defenders. The Normandy beaches with their dunes, narrow paths, music, and obstacles limited the maneuverability of the German forces. The armored vehicles advanced with difficulty, exposed to Allied fire from high ground and to naval and air artillery bombardments. The infantry units accompanying the tanks could not maintain cohesion due to the open terrain and constant attacks, causing each counterattack music to fragment before reaching the enemy line. As the day progressed, it became clear that the collapse of the defense was not solely due to the Allied numerical and technological superiority, but also to a combination of internal factors: lack of coordination, indecisiveness of the command, dispersion of troops, and psychological music exhaustion. What on maps and plans looked like a possible counterattack had turned into succession of isolated efforts intended to delay, not stop, the enemy advance. For German soldiers, D-Day became a constant exercise in endurance under extreme pressure. Every bunker defended, every machine gun operated, and every tank music deployed represented an attempt to maintain cohesion against an enemy that had already mastered surprise, coordination, and meticulous planning. However, the collapse was inevitable. The defense could not be sustained when the command structure was paralyzed, the units fragmented, and the terrain dominated by the adversary. By the end of the first few hours, the counterattack attempts had disintegrated. What remained was a partially defended front with gaps opened, communications disrupted, and isolated units. Resistance would continue in various sectors for days, but the possibility of repelling the invasion as a coherent whole had disappeared. The combination of Allied planning, strategic surprise, and internal German errors had turned D-Day into an absolute example of how even solid defensive music system can collapse when coordination, speed of decision-making, and flexibility are lacking at the most critical moment. The collapse of music, the defense in Normandy, was neither instantaneous nor uniform. It was a process that unfolded as German forces attempted to react to an unprecedented attack with insufficient resources, fragmented command, and the enemy exploiting every weakness. From the German perspective, that day showed the fragility of a system that seemed invincible on paper, but in practice was vulnerable to the combination of tactical innovation, coordination, and constant pressure from the enemy. After D-Day, retreat, attrition, and the beginning of the end in the West. As the tide of Allied men and equipment began to consolidate in Normandy, it became clear to the German high command that the initial defense had failed in its purpose to stop the landing on the beaches. What began as an effort to contain the invasion quickly became a protracted process of attrition, retreat, and forced reorganization. From the German perspective, D-Day was not only an immediate tactical failure but also the beginning of the end, a process that would unfold for months. Along the entire music Western Front, the first critical hours had already left visible scars: destroyed bunkers, breached defensive positions, isolated soldiers, and a music-paralyzed command still trying to regroup. However, the magnitude of the impact became clear as the Allies advanced inland, consolidating beachheads and securing communication and supply routes. For the Germans, every kilometer of territory lost meant not only a tactical advantage for the enemy, but also a psychological blow to troops who had trusted that the Atlantic Wall could withstand music any onslaught. The retreat was becoming inevitable in certain sectors. It was disorganized withdrawal, but neither could it be considered a fully planned maneuver. The officers attempted to reorganize scattered units, withdraw exhausted soldiers, secure secondary defensive positions, and protect the supply lines that were still functioning. Every move had to balance the need to preserve forces with the urgency of maintaining some semblance of a coherent front against a relentlessly advancing enemy. The human toll was immediate and brutal. German soldiers, already strained by the pressure of the invasion, were forced to fight extreme conditions: long marches under fire, shortages of supplies, limited communications, and constant clashes with Allied music units superior in number and weaponry, mental and physical fatigue compounded the fear, and morale, which had withstood the initial onslaught with discipline, began to erode. Every position lost, every bridge blown up, every column of tanks destroyed reinforced the feeling that the defense was an impossible race against Allied logistics, coordination, music, and innovation. The German command, for its part, had to face a crucial strategic dilemma: attempt isolated and localized counterattacks to regain ground or conserve reserves to try to stop the enemy penetration later on. The choice was rarely clear. Counterattack attempts, when they were launched, were fragmented and often came too late. Units moved music in a scattered fashion, lacking full coordination, exposed to enemy fire, and hampered by the lack of effective air support. Music which the Allies almost completely dominated, each tactical action offered unavoidable losses, further reducing future maneuverability. Meanwhile, German logistics were beginning to fail critically. Supplies of ammunition, fuel, food, and medicine could not keep pace with the intensity of the fighting. The inland roads of Normandy, already narrow and frequently destroyed, could not handle the flow of reinforcements and supplies. Every logistical delay further weakened the ability to maintain a cohesive front. Even the available armored vehicles were sometimes stuck in traffic jams or destroyed before reaching effective combat. The attrition was amplified by the constant harassment from Allied aircraft and artillery. Strategic music and tactical bombing raids not only destroyed fortifications and vehicles, but also directly affected the morale of the soldiers and the coordination of the units. Modern warfare, with its combination of masked firepower, mobility, and control of airspace, had proven to be a challenge that static German defenses could not overcome without flexible and rapid command, a capability that was still lacking. As the days passed, the German Western Front began to transform. What had been a planned defense became a series of improvised lines where units attempted to delay the enemy while they reorganized or to more defensible positions. The retreat music, although strategic, involved constant losses. Soldiers, weapons, vehicles, and ammunition disappeared before the Allied advances. The Atlantic Wall, which was supposed to be an insurmountable obstacle, had lost much of its deterrent effect. The open breaches and disorganization showed that even the strongest fortifications were vulnerable to a modern invasion, well coordinated and executed by surprise. From the German perspective, D-Day also represented an irreversible shift in the dynamics of the war in the West. The Allied operation not only established beachheads but also marked the beginning of a sustained advance into France music, and eventually into Germany. Every kilometer gained by the Allies reduced the German capacity to counterattack, reorganize forces, and maintain a coherent defensive front. The war, which until then had been fought with relative success in other areas of the continent, began to show the vulnerability of the Reich to Allied coordination, tactical innovation, and logistical superiority. Ultimately, the psychological and strategic impact of D-Day was profound. For the soldiers, it meant facing a music more organized, motivated, and technically superior enemy. For the officers and high command, it demonstrated the inability of a rigid and centralized system to react to a rapid and multifaceted attack. The retreat, attrition, and loss of control marked the beginning of the end on the Western Front. The invasion had not only compromised immediate defenses but had irreversibly altered the strategic balance music in Western Europe. In that sense, June 6, 1944, was not simply a day of combat. It was the beginning of a process that transformed the Western Front and laid the groundwork for Germany's defeat in Europe. The combination of meticulous Allied planning, coordinated execution, and exploitation of German weaknesses turned a defensive system music that seemed solid on paper into a set of fragmented and vulnerable positions. The retreat, the attrition, and the gradual collapse of the defense marked from the first day a path that Germany could not reverse. The day Germany lost France. Consequences of the landings. June 6, 1944 marked a turning point in European military history, and for Germany it meant the beginning of a loss that could no longer be stopped: control over France, and with it the integrity of the Western Front. D-Day was not just a landing on the beaches, it was a strategic blow that exposed the fragilities of a military system that music, until then, had managed to impose its will over much of Europe. The consequences were immediate and numerous. Militarily, the invasion forced Germany to redistribute forces from other sectors, weakening its defenses in the east and compromising its ability to respond coherently to other threats. The divisions that could have reinforced the Eastern Front were diverted or immobilized, and the strategic reserves that were meant to contain Allied vanguard movements were quickly worn down. The need to react urgently to the Allied advance disrupted the original planning, forcing the improvisation of defenses and maneuvers that were often insufficient or too late. The collapse of the defenses in Normandy and the gradual loss of French territory also had a devastating psychological effect. The morale of soldiers and officers suffered as they realized that German superiority, which had dominated European battlefields for years, was no longer enough to contain a coordinated, well-supplied, and technologically advanced enemy. Prestige of the German army, which until then had projected an image of invincibility, suffered an irreparable blow. The feeling of the inevitability of an Allied victory began to permeate the ranks in the high command. Politically, the loss of France meant a weakening of Nazi control over Western Europe. The German occupation, which had been solid and disciplined, began to face serious logistical and administrative problems. Supply routes were disrupted by local resistance and Allied bombing. Urban centers became hotbeds of insecurity and coordination between Germany and the collaborationist authorities became increasingly complicated. Every kilometer of territory lost represented an additional pressure point that complicated the Reich's ability to sustain the war on multiple fronts. In strategic terms, the landing allowed the Allies to establish a beachhead that quickly expanded inland, securing essential ports and communication routes. France went from being an occupied territory to an open field of operations from where the Allies could project force directly towards Germany. The Allied advance transformed the war of attrition into a mobile war in the West, forcing Germany to fight on terrain where the rigidity of its command and reliance on static fortifications music were deadly disadvantages. German logistics, already strained by the war in the East and production music limitations, were overwhelmed. Transporting supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to Normandy music became a near impossible challenge. Damaged roads, constant air raids, and a lack of sufficient transport meant that even the units that were able to operate moved slowly and in fragments. Each delay increased the effectiveness of the Allied advance and deepened the German crisis on the Western Front. The human impact was also significant. Thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the days following the landing. The losses not only reduced combat capability but also affected unit cohesion and the morale of the survivors. For many, Normandy became a scene of despair where the survival of individuals' music and small groups became more important than any strategic objective. The war, which until then had been fought in an orderly manner under rigid command structures, was transformed into a fragmented and chaotic struggle. Beyond the immediate events, D-Day marked a turning point in World War II. The loss of France opened a second front that Germany could not ignore, forcing the Reich to divide music, resources, men, and strategies at a critical moment. The room for maneuver, which had been one of the pillars of German success in previous campaigns, was drastically reduced. Every partial victory in the East or on other fronts was now conditioned by the constant pressure of the Allied advance from the West. Finally, the Normandy landing showed that even the most disciplined army with decades of experience and carefully constructed fortifications could be overcome by a combination of factors that redefine the concept music of modern warfare. Absolute surprise, meticulous coordination between infantry, armored vehicles, artillery, and aircraft. Tactical innovation at every scale of combat and efficient logistics that ensured ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements at the right time and place. The beaches, which the Germans had considered virtually impregnable, became a scene where detailed planning and Allied flexibility prevailed over the rigidity of a centralized command and a seemingly solid defensive system. For Germany, D-Day was much more than defeat on the sand of the Normandy beaches. It was the beginning of the progressive loss of control over Western Europe, a blow that transcended the tactical and reached the strategic and psychological. The Allied operation dismantled the illusion of invulnerability that had accompanied the German army for years and brutally exposed the inability of the Nazi command to react quickly and coherently music to an innovative and coordinated enemy. What seemed sufficient in war manuals and fortification plans to resist an invasion proved insufficient in the face of the dynamic and complex reality of modern combat. June 6, 1944. Not only signified the loss of territory, it represented the first visible fracture on the Western Front. Turning point that weakened the cohesion of German units, eroded the morale of the soldiers, and underscored the structural limitations of the military music command. Every kilometer of beach captured, every beachhead consolidated, every bridge or road secured by the Allies transformed the German defense into a succession of isolated, improvised, and in the long run futile attempts. The feeling of powerlessness and the awareness of the inevitability of the Allied advance began to permeate among officers and soldiers, marking a profound change in the perception of the war. It was no longer just about discipline, training, and fortifications. Now the ability to react quickly, constant adaptation, and superior coordination were determining factors. In a broader sense, the landing demonstrated that modern warfare was a system in which strategic music, planning, precise execution, technological innovation, and efficient logistics could overcome even the most formidable defense. Germany, which for years had managed to impose its will on music, Europe through tactics, training, and discipline, found itself facing an enemy capable of combining these elements synergistically. The defeat in Normandy was therefore catalyst that triggered an irreversible process: music, the gradual liberation of France, the constant pressure on German resources and supply lines, and finally the opening of a Western front that Germany could no longer contain. From the German perspective, D-Day symbolized the beginning of an inevitable decline. The Nazi occupation, which until then had managed to control vast territories with relative efficiency, began to crumble under the combined pressure of external forces and the internal inefficiency of the command. The Allied operation showed that the future of warfare would no longer be defined solely by individual tenacity or the strength of fortifications. It would be decided by the ability to adapt, coordinate, and execute rapid decisions under constant pressure. In that area, Germany had failed irreversibly, marking not only a one-day defeat but the beginning of the end of its dominance in Western Europe and ultimately the prelude to the fall of the Reich.